Good morning. I'm John Bitson, the Menard Family Director of the Sheila and Robert Challey Institute for Global Innovation and Growth. Welcome to the Human Progress and Flourishing Workshop. In this workshop, we bring in speakers from across the country, scholars, to present their research and engage in a discussion with the NDSU community. And I'm really excited today. I'm always excited about these, but especially I'm excited today that my PhD advisor, Dr. James Peoples, is here today. He's a great mentor and a great friend, and we're going to spend a lot of time with him tomorrow too. So I'm really excited that he's here today. I'm going to go ahead and read his bio. And I think his bio, when you hear the bio, it speaks a lot to the kind of person that James is. Very humble. He doesn't list. He has a ton of publications, and he's edited a ton of books as well, but none of that is listed in his bio. So just know that this bio is an understatement of who James is. So Dr. James Peoples is professor of economics at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. His research interests include transportation economics and labor economics. His current projects are focused on transportation costs and healthcare labor markets. He received his PhD in economics from the University of California at Berkeley. And again, I'm very grateful to James for coming today and for all the help that he's given me in my career. And so I'm excited for you to learn more about him and his research. And so we'll have time after his presentation that you can ask your own questions. So please have your questions ready. And then without any further delay, let's welcome Dr. James Peoples.
Hello, everyone. Thank you again, John. And believe me, I learned quite a bit from John when we worked together at UWM. As John said, my research looks primarily at transportation, and I look at transportation, productivity, efficiency, and labor markets. Every time I looked at issues in those areas, I saw that technology was an important driver for all the outcomes. For productivity growth, technology was quite important. For labor markets, the ability to be a flexible worker and adjust to new technology was also very important. So I'll focus now on the technology aspect. Okay, so why should we even care about transportation services? And I'll look at this from the point of view of an economist. So regardless of your economy, regardless of the country, economics, the economies are heavily dependent on a well-functioning transportation system. So I'm going to split my talk into two distinct parts. And the first part is I'm going to try as best as I can to convince you that transportation matters and why it matters, and give you some idea of the complexities and expansiveness of transportation networks. Then I'll get to the technology which helps drive the efficiency among those transportation networks. Okay, so the important part of the importance of a good transportation system. And this is challenging to talk about transportation now because of supply chain backups. And I don't want to sound too Pollyannish when I do this. So I do understand that the supply chain bottlenecks has made this much more complicated to have efficiency. But if you think about the importance of transportation, just think about the ubiquitousness of the grocery store, the CVS, Walgreens, they're everywhere. Usually, not necessarily in this climate, it's well-stocked. This is not a trivial outcome to have well-stocked, easy access to food, to healthcare prescription. So that has a lot to do with the well-functioning logistics transportation system. We also have, because of transportation, pretty well-stocked raw materials for construction, for shelter, at Lowe's, Menards, the whole bit. So what I'm trying to get at is, in our country, in a developing country, it is so easy for us maybe to take for granted easy access to all these important products and commodities, which is not the case internationally, especially in developing countries. So what I like to look at is, if this is so important, how does it work? And a big part of how it works and why it works has to do with the networks. And they're quite overlaying, and that my first part of this lecture will be to look at that overlay. So again, the question is, how are transportation systems, how do they contribute to having access to all these products, healthcare products, raw materials products, food products, without having a lack of inventory? I understand this is kind of a pre-COVID type of a mindset. I'll talk about COVID at the end of this. So what I want to show in the first part of this is how complex and expansive the network is, how we are able to, at least in the US and many developing countries, how we're able to provide this service relatively seamlessly. And it may have been not a blessing in disguise. It may have helped us to see how important logistics are to a functioning economy with the COVID experience. Okay, so now I'm gonna focus on rail, air transport services, and waterways as my major transportation sectors. Yes, I know this pipeline, but I only have so much time. It is a bit of a challenge when you say transportation systems. There are a lot of systems in there. So I'll try and get all of them through to you guys. So let's start off with a system that we're all familiar with, and that is the interstate highway system. Pretty expansive. The overall highway system has 161,000 miles. I'll show a figure of this in the next slide. 47,000 of that is federally funded interstate system, starting Eisenhower administration. Excuse me. So this is important primarily for our surface transportation for trucking industries. And trucking industry is pretty big in the US, and I'll show that as the slideshow goes on. So they have free access in general, except for toll roads along this interstate highway system. Overall, and I put that last bullet point, there are 4.17 million statute, just basically means land miles in the US. I put that in there. Oh, thank you, John. Okay, sorry about that. I mentioned the 4.17 million miles because the huge heavy trucks do not travel on those off roads. But FedEx, UPS, Amazon Prime does use those roads. So that's why it's important to note that we have a very extensive transportation system that makes it easy to deliver, not just to the retail outlets, but now with e-commerce to deliver to your home. Now, John, I'm on task. So this is just a picture to show you, you don't see what I'm seeing on my screen here. It doesn't look like what's up there. This is just a picture to show you how extensive the interstate system is, heavily on the East Coast, somewhat on the Midwest. And you can see on this slide, if you could get closer, that Route 94 goes right through Fargo and can take you to where I'm from, Milwaukee. So this is quite convenient, but my point is very expansive and expensive to keep up. Okay, so that's surface transportation for our trucking system. For the other surface form of transportation, that's the rail system. There are 140,000 miles of rail track accessible and used by Class 1. That's the large ones. That's the 7 or 8 major freight companies, Class 2 and Class 3. So the map following this one shows that a major supplier through Dakota or use in Dakota is the Burlington Northern Santa Fe. And probably a lot of the commodity that's transported, soybeans as well as wheat. Let me move forward here. Okay, so here's, now what you'll notice on this graph. So here, overlay this with the previous graph with all of the interstate highway, and I didn't show the statute roads because that was just been a bunch of spaghetti. That's quite an expansive system. On this one, you'll notice something. It's east-west transportation, which means it's going to be important for these rail companies to have some connectivity if you're going to go east-west. All right, so this gives you some hint about the type of technology needed for the system to work efficiently. So again, two things to get from this. Here's, overlay this with the figure I had before. This is a very complicated and expansive system. How do we make it work? That's critical, and that's what this talk is about. So I also said I would talk about water. Two major sources of transportation for water. The first one is our inland waterways. Of course, you're restricted to having navigable waterways, of which there are 12,000 miles, not as expansive as our road service. There are actually 25,000 navigable miles. We're not using all of them, with some 257 locks that we use to transport. Weather does influence the efficiency and that one can receive from using barges. But as I'll talk, the benefit of barges, if you have access to the waterways, are that they are quite efficient, fuel efficient, and that has some influence on pollution emissions, which I'll talk about also. So two of the major, you can see up here, sources of commodities are aggregates, which is what's used to make concrete, and coal. A lot of that comes from Ohio and Kentucky, shipped all the way down to Louisiana. So maybe it doesn't look as expansive, but what's important about having barges, at least on the eastern part of our country, it provides shippers with an alternative to rail and to trucking, but not everywhere. And in fact, the work that I've done on that's looked at that choice, it is important to have that third choice if you want to have some competitive rates. Okay, so that's the picture of, you can see it's not as expansive, and it could be if we were to have greater infrastructure investment, there are another 12,000 navigable miles that could be used for freight service. Okay, so for the ocean, so this is the ocean shipping container industry is international. So far what I've talked about, rail, trucking, pretty much national. Yes, there's some international in North America with Canada and with Mexico. But it is the ocean container that allows and provides for a lot of our international transport of a lot of high volume products. So products such as coal, energy products, coal, oil, but also shipping of large manufactured goods such as cars, appliances. The service may not be as fast, and however, that service is quite important to an international trade distribution. Okay, so the importance is, with the shipping container industry, that opens up a lot of our international trade. And that's what's critical about that. So maybe not overlaying with the last two types of transportation I talked about with rail and with trucking. Maybe, and I'll show later, some competition from aeronautical, from airport services, airline services. So just some idea of the network also, again, with freight, and I only have the primary and secondary shipping with some of the key touch points where there could be, we could have supply chain issues if those checkpoints become problematic or bottleneck. Okay. This picture I put in simply to show you the importance of ocean container shipping. This is the Port of LA, the largest port with respect to volume, and not too far from it is the Port of Long Beach. Something like 2/5 of all of our international transport goes through those two ports. something happens there, you have significant supply chain issues. And I just wanted to give some visual aspect of how complicated this is. So you're looking at these containers and you're thinking, how do we know what's in them? How do we get it in an efficient manner to the final destination? That's partly what this talk is about. So I'm getting to that part. That'll be the second part of this presentation. There we go. There's the picture now. So this is what a normal port looks like. Those structures you see in the background are the cranes. And again, the whole point for showing you this is really how important this is, how much the possibility of there being bottlenecks in supply chain network at these ports. What I should have had is also a picture showing you a lot of these ships out at sea just sitting there in queue. And that's one of the big problems we're facing right now. Okay, and then lastly is air transport. Again, I'm not looking at pipeline, would have taken too long. We can broadly describe this sector as passenger service and cargo service. So the big domestic passenger services are Delta, United, America, Southwest. And then for cargo, we have, it's all cargo, and you have the integrators. Integrators have both land operation as well as air operation. So that would be FedEx and UPS. And I just gave some list of some, not random, some all cargo carriers, and they're all DHL, the German DHL operator, and they contract services out to DHL. Airlines is a little different. The air service for cargo, most planes aren't built for high volume products such as cars, but jumbo jets are now being built such that they can provide that service. Most of their products are high value, low volume, such as electronics, smartphones, laptops. So there's money to be made there. So when I showed charts after this, it may not look as though there's a lot of activity in cargo going on with airlines, but that's because a lot of the data looks at the actual volume, not at the value of that product. But nonetheless, they are quite important. So again, this service, there we go. And if I showed the network for all the passenger airlines, it would just be one big blob of red. So I just give you some idea of one more overlay. And so this is three-dimensional. You've got air service, you have nautical service, you have land statute service, all three operating. How do we coordinate all of these systems to get that laptop from South Korea to Fargo, North Dakota? And we take it for granted, but it's very complicated. And that's what I'm trying to show on these. The next part, we'll look at the actual routes for the integrator, which is, I just chose FedEx. FedEx has a hub in Memphis. UPS's hub is in Louisville. FedEx actually has more than just that one hub. So this is even more expansive than you can see, but then I have here, the point is you have all of these systems playing at once. How do we get them connected and to interact, provide an efficient service? Okay, so what's shipped and how important is that to our economy? And that's what I'm showing on the next graph. A lot of key energy sources of energies, raw materials for construction, products for pharmaceuticals are shipped by the transportation companies that I just mentioned. And what I wanted to show here was how important transportation is to our economy, given what they actually transport. So I can say real quickly that for the right-hand side, the green side, when we're looking at electronic equipment, a lot of that now is being transported by air service. On the left, fuel products, oil, petroleum, that's a combination of trucking and rail, as well as coal. And then for cereal, wheat, a lot of that is barge as well as rail. Okay, so that's just to show you the amount of volume that is shipped and how important these products are, the well-functioning economy, how important this is to have a well-functioning transportation system that provides this service. Okay, so that was, the last graph was pretty static. Let me see what year was that. That was for, I believe, 2019. This is a little more dynamic. Now, I got to be careful. This is the best data I had for this, but actually this data stops at 2014. So the last few bars are actually projections. Oops, we had COVID, and those projections are quite a bit off. What I want to show was, in general, the growth in the transportation of goods and services provided by these transportation companies. If you look at this, that blue bar, the real tall one, that's trucking. Trucking is where most of our goods are transported. Rail comes in second. There is some growth there, fairly not significant, but pretty much growth over time. Trucking transportation continued to grow during the COVID recession/crisis, as well as did rail. Now, if you look at airlines, it's really small, but this is by, again, ton miles, not by the value of the service, not by the value of the product. So that's a little bit of a distortion. Nonetheless, you should be able to bifurcate it. So this is a little misleading. Airline services is bifurcated in that over time, it has been the cargo or the packaging services that's really flourished. Where passenger service has been hit hard with COVID. So if they were to not have predicted and done a prediction for 1920, you would have seen a drop in airline passenger service. And in this case, you would have seen a slight increase in packages transported because of e-commerce demand. Okay, and so just to be complete, I wanted to show what happened with passenger service. This is my whole point. All these industries are growing. That last part is that's not a prediction. That is actually a big drop in passenger service, about almost 2/3 drop during COVID, and we're just now seeing a comeback from that service. So the problem with when we had COVID was that you had to have distancing and you had a reduction in the number of flights, but the overall trend is positive for airline service. Okay. So what's the point? So far, so that's the first half. What I hope you've gained from this first half is how expansive and complex our transportation networks are. So that was the whole point of that first part. How do you manage transporting all these important goods and commodities through that system? So the technology, which is what this talk is primarily about, I feel can be split into two major categories. One, many of these companies have invested heavily into energy-saving technologies, which I'll now talk about. And then two is the use of logistics. And that is important to provide what is key now to our e-commerce, which is just-in-time service. Okay, so trying to get that product to the customer within 2 days, which is a challenge when we have supply chain backups. Why do I show this graph? Because I just like it. The rules I do this is more historical. So for the rail industry, a big change in technology, of course, was from steam engine to diesel. I get that, but also the change from manual switching systems to digital switching systems. This was not only something that happened in rail, it happened also in telecommunications. If you can think about it, from my age group, they still had telephone operators, and now it's all electronic switching, instantaneous. Well, the reason I brought this in is because I will talk about the employment effect of technology. And before we add digital switching systems, so you can see there, the switching system simply is going to take the track and allow it to go to a different direction, the train go to a different direction. That was done manually. Now it's just switching systems done very efficiently. A big drop in a key well-paying occupation, which was a switch. They used to call them switchmen back then. And those jobs are now lost. This is part of the outcome of enhanced and changing technology. So that's the reason this slide is here, because it's associated with a technology that led to a decline in a certain type of occupation. Okay. So how have these industries incorporated new technology to save energy? And this energy saving technology has also reduced pollution emissions. So there is this external effect of the technology. So this is the heart of my talk. If I were to divide this up for the energy saving, there's been a switch from primarily fossil fuel to greater use of electrical vehicles in both locomotives, aircrafts, heavy trucks, not so much barges, and containerized ships. For those, there's also been a use of the type of material, lighter weight material for these vehicles. I'm not going to go through the whole list here. The point is, in order to provide an affordable and competitive service, it was incumbent upon these companies to find ways to provide the service that was fuel efficient. If we look at the political economy, what's going on here, the political, geopolitical challenges right now going on, which affects the petroleum industry and the fossil fuel industry, it is critical that companies find ways to minimize the use of fuel and optimize and minimize their costs. So energizing saving technology, we have fuel efficient vehicles that we're using and lighter weight vehicles. That's been the primary approach to reducing cost. I also thought it was important, even relative to modes, inland barges is probably the most efficient, cost efficient, and fuel efficient way to transport these large commodities. And you can see the numbers here. This also contributes to a reduction in CO2 emissions. Even though rail and trucks are much more fuel efficient, they have a long ways to go to catch up with inland barges. Again, the problem with inland barges is you need to have navigable waterways. And so it's nice that they provide that service, low cost, low fuel, high fuel efficiency. However, they're not available everywhere. Okay, so this is to give us, now let me be careful with this chart. This gives us some idea of what has happened over time with emissions. It looks as though, and it is correct, that the emissions have increased over time. But this is in total gigabytes of CO2. While we have very minor increases well, it's not minor, it's not statistically significant increases, there has not been a decrease in CO2 emissions. But this is not the way to look at this data. At the same time, what I tried to show earlier, there's been a significant increase in tonnage transport of the goods and services. So what's happened is we're transporting more goods with a slight increase in the CO2 emissions. So there's still work to do to improve the fuel efficiency, but enough has been done that we have not had an equal increase in the amount of and volume of goods transported with the increase in CO2. In fact, the amount of goods transported has far exceeded the increase in CO2 emissions. The challenge now is to stabilize, which seems like it's pretty close to doing, stabilize that increase and eventually reduce that increase while we're increasing transportation of goods and services. The other part of the technology improvements has been the use of better logistics software. So when I end the talk, I will talk about the supply chain challenges. What I have is a small list of changes in logistics that help provide a more efficient and fast service. One bullet point 3 is one that I thought was quite interesting. This is for the ocean containerized shipping. So one of the major challenges that ocean liners face is capsizing if there's bad weather. And so having this software that allows them to forecast whether or not they're going to have these swells matters, because that's going to not only reduce the risk of losing their cargo, but also minimize the amount of time that's going to be wasted facing these little, no pun intended, headwinds. Also, part of what we've seen with the change in technology in the transportation sector had a lot to do with the 9/11 challenge in 2001. After that, the federal government, in conjunction with transportation services, instituted a logistics software and to allow for better tracking of goods and products being shipped. And in doing that, it makes it easier. Now, you may take it for granted that you go on Amazon and you want to purchase that laptop and you can get it within 2 days, but you can keep tracking it with FedEx, you can track with UPS. Part of that had to do with the federal government's response to 9/11, so they could keep track of what's being sent and where. So all of that contributes to a more efficient service. Okay, so the change in the ability to forecast the conditions for ocean and sea weather, the ability to easily track where that product is. If we go back to that graph that had all the containers, visually what's in that container, you don't know. But because you are able to have tracking, you're able to see what's in each one of those containers and makes it easier for the shipper to know where is that shipment in the process. Again, it also makes it easier to understand, to navigate all of those systems that are interlaid. Oops, I just went there. Okay. So now, what has this? So we have 2 types of technology: fuel efficiency and logistics. How do I get a product or commodity from point A to point B in the most efficient manner? How do I combine all of these possible transportation modes to get that product to my final destination in an efficient manner without contributing to significant pollution? So with this new technology, which is necessary to compete internationally, we're able to show that there's been an increase. You got to excuse me here. I'm having a little issues with my machine here. So I just need to, my screen doesn't show what's being said on here. What is on here? The labor saving. Okay, thank you. Okay, so there's been one effect on emissions and the other effect on labor. So the technology, as I said earlier, in rail, we lost a lot of high-paying good jobs for switching operators. But it has also, because technology has reduced cost, there's greater demand for these services, and this leads to the supply chain challenge that we have. There's also been an increase in demand, primarily for truck drivers. I'm sure you guys have been familiar with this. So with that increase in truck drivers and an increase in workers in warehouses, part of the warehouse result is that's the Amazon integrator, FedEx, UPS integration, needing warehouses to store their goods and services, which helps them address the issue of supply chain backlogs. I included the 2019 and 2021 results just to see what happened with the COVID crisis. With COVID, we still had a pretty heavy increase in employment for warehouse workers and truck drivers. The problem is there has not been the increase in supply of truck drivers. And I'll talk about that pretty soon in the upcoming slides. The big loser in COVID was the employment of workers in the passenger air service because of the lack of demand for that service, which is now coming back. Okay, so two issues here. One, the technology has helped some occupations while limiting demand for others. And the major winners in this have been truck drivers and those at warehouses. Nonetheless, most of these jobs are well paid. Okay, so I just want to look over time. What's happened to employment. So I'm gonna look at this one more time. Transportation demand has gone up for primarily truck drivers and warehouse over time. And a lot of this, again, if you have a good logistics system, that is going to increase the demand for workers in that overall system. The changes in locomotives for rail has reduced the need for a lot of occupations. There used to be an occupation called fireman. There is no need for anyone to shovel coal into the furnace anymore to drive the trains. Having this new technology has reduced demand for many of the services in rail. But overall, technology has contributed to demand for employment, demand for workers, but it's also required a new skill set for those workers. I'll almost end. The last issue I'll look at with the technology is its influence on developing nations. And this has been somewhat mixed. So what we've shown that we have a better logistics system that can connect different transportation sectors and allows for, in normal times, just-in-time delivery. For developing countries, the biggest challenge that they face is their connectivity. And I will, in the next graph, one continent has improved. I went a little too fast, sorry. And that has been some of the countries in Africa. Now, even though you're seeing an increase in connectivity, connectivity just means the ability to connect with other transportation systems from other countries to provide international service. Even though you see that increase, both Africa and Latin America have some of the lowest connectivity indexes of all continents. And my apologies for using a continent. I don't want to generalize all countries in Africa. But that's where the data didn't allow me to disaggregate it at the country level. So in comparison, to show how well Africa is doing, their growth in their their growth and their revenue ton miles is pretty impressive recently. It has exceeded that as in the industry as a whole. Unfortunately for Latin America, which does have major connectivity problems, there's still a long way to go. We have the technology, but the technology doesn't matter if you can't connect to it. And that's the major issue you have in Latin America, and to a certain extent in sub-Saharan Africa. In addition to having the capacity at their ports don't allow them to take full advantage of possible demand for their services. So I'll conclude by noting, again, we need an efficient transportation sector for healthy economies. We've shown that all of our goods, many of our goods and services are transported through this system. And we've seen how technology has promoted an efficient operating system. Now, I've been looking at this kind of through Pollyannish eyes, and so let me now end by getting a little more real. I understand that we have significant supply chain issues, which I would probably dissect into three major reasons. One is a shortage of production and workers. So with COVID, a lot of operations were shut down, especially in manufacturing. And they've had a hard time ramping up again. It's not that easy to ramp up manufacturing processes. So part of this was, with the supply chain issue, was industries having a shortage of manufacturing products, and two, a shortage of workers. The second problem is simply an unexpected jump in demand for goods and services that the industry was not prepared to address. That should work its way out. A third problem from this was lack of adequate infrastructure and capacity. That's difficult. In an industry where it's important to provide just-in-time service without too much surplus capacity, it is difficult to predict how much capacity is needed. Yes, right now, the big issue in supply chain management is having enough chassis at the ports to allow for the transport of the goods from the ports. That's easy to say, but do you want too many chassis and you have this excess, chassis, or do you want just enough so you can meet demand? That is the importance of having a strong logistics system. I would suggest, and this is what's happening now with regards to the lack of shortage of truck drivers, what has finally happened in the trucking industry is they are starting to pay higher wages to these individuals if they want to get these products transported. Then I think a question would be, well, why? There's always been this high turnover in the trucking industry for workers. And part of that is the model that a lot of the companies use. It is less costly to employ new entry truck drivers because you pay them a lower wages. So those lower wages more than offset what would have happened by paying higher wages to keep them in service. So that has come to a head now with the shortage of workers who are saying what you're paying is not enough. And by doing that, we then have a backlog of products being shipped. So more investment in human capital, such as higher wages, not just for the truck drivers, but also for a lot of the manufacturing workers are saying, I'm not being paid enough. You need to pay me more to have these services provided efficiently. I'll end by saying this, by the last part. In normal circumstances, the US has a fairly well operating logistics system over a very complex and expansive network. COVID-19 has provided a stress test for the system. It has revealed where we need to make some changes. Changes in our capacity, changes in the shortage and the payment of workers, and continual improvements in our logistics. So if I leave you with this, 2 points of this lecture. One, transportation services are vital to a healthy economy, but maintaining a well-functioning transportation system requires continual investment in logistics and infrastructure. Thank you. And if you have any questions, let me know. Yes.
Well, we all understand we need to invest in the infrastructure, but what's the top priority for us? Should we invest in the highway or rail system, water, airline? Which system we should invest? Given all these CO2 concerns, the employment, all the other efficiencies, all these factors, which one you suggest us to invest first?
For the infrastructure.
Yes.
Okay, so you want how to rank order this? The challenge of that question? So again, the question is, how do we rank order which transportation service to invest in for infrastructure improvements? The challenge of that question is they're all interconnected. So you basically need to invest in all 4 or 5 of these systems. However, having said that, if you invest in greater capacity at the ports, that's going to address a lot of the issues for all of the systems I just told you about. Okay, because if I'm shipping a truck, it doesn't matter how efficient my logistics software is. If there is a backup at sea for that product, I'm not going to be able to use, I'm not going to be able to access that commodity. So by investing in a higher capacity at the port, not only does it help ocean liners, it also does help the trucking industry. So there's a way you can invest, rather than rank order, there's a way, what do you invest in? I would say investing in port infrastructure is critical because that's a key linchpin in the delivery of these transportation services. I hope that answers your question.
Then another question, do we have a federal agency organize all of these and have a planning of all these, or because all of them are so important? Is any department coordinating all these efforts, investment in this sector?
So the question is there a central department that considers how to make these investments and where to make the investments? I would say that would go through the DOT, Department of Transportation. And if we look at the most recent federal bill from this administration, it focuses on what you just said. It gave guidance. That bill gave guidance to where we're going to invest. So yet the DOT has the research to answer that question, how to intelligently and efficiently invest our money in infrastructure and logistics. So yes, the DOT is probably this central office. And I think that, I think that answers the question. Yes.
Thank you. Great presentation. So you mentioned that the tracking has been a key policy for managing efficiencies.
Right.
So visibility in supply chains have an impact on supply chain efficiency. However, we have seen that it has been not enough to avoid supply chain issues or any disruptions in supply chain.
Mm-hmm.
So, to which point is technology or more technology enough to avoid those kind of disruptions?
Great question.
What policy changes do you suggest?
So the question is, I'm going to tweak it a little bit. Given what we face with the COVID crisis, we've seen disruptions in the delivery of services. Have the logistics software been able to address these disruptions? Am I categorizing this reasonably well? Okay, so there's only so much logistics can do. Part of this is a supply and demand issue. So let's just focus, if we focus on those chips being produced in China. So China finds out if in the supply chain network, you're heavily reliant on a specific location, and that's what COVID has shown us, that's the risk. That's not the logistics software issue. That is relying a lack of diversification and location placement issue. So what possibly should happen, I don't know if that's a policy issue. Policy could create incentive to develop chips in other locations to avoid one heavy producer having such a large influence on the production of a vital product. Logistics software can provide an efficient way to use this integrated system, but it cannot address a lack of supply and an unanticipated increase in demand. As most free market economists would say, let the system work. And you may not like it, folks, but it may mean higher prices. We may have gotten pretty comfortable with relatively low prices for these products. And now we're finding out if you rely on one major supplier and that's a disruption, you could wind up with higher prices. If prices go up, the general theory is demand should start to go down and you see an easing on that process. So good question. I think the logistics software is pretty darn good. But I think the problem is relying on a few monopolies through the system for the supply. Yes.
Competition is an issue. Do you think is that case? More competition, transportation.
So the question is a more market-oriented place, more market-oriented approach to dealing with the supply chain backups. I would like to hear some of my other economist friends chime into this. I believe that there is reasonable intermodal competition, but there's also intermodal coordination. So many of those long distance rail transports, they may rely on short haul, sometimes trains, but they rely a lot on the coordination, integrated services with trucking. So what competition solve this? Internationally, there is competition, although there are a lot of alliances. Ocean liners have formed a lot of alliances that could cause a problem, but there's enough competition such that the issue is not whether or not the rates are relatively low. Again, the issue is competition from suppliers. And I think that's the big problem. Yes.
Thank you very much for the talk. It was very, very interesting. And I have a question about what percentage do you think of the issues that you talked about that are because of COVID-19 exacerbate the transportation system itself, and not taking into account, supply and demand? Because I see from your talk that the way I would conceptualize the transportation system would be like a framework that connects two ends. And I think the inefficiency is happening at both ends. And so, yeah, that was just.
So he's asked, so the question is, without looking at supply and demand framework, what is contributing to the supply chain issue? The networks itself. So I believe the networks are reasonably efficient in using the logistics software. Yes. Can it be improved is the issue. And so the problem in the network, I believe, and you're correct, or at the ends, is capacity. So right now, we have a shortage of capacity, which is going to disrupt the efficient flow of goods and services. But you didn't want me to use supply and demand in the analysis, but that's because of supply and demand. There's a shortage of workers, that's on the supply side, and there's a shortage of chips. But there's also been this pent-up demand as we move out of this COVID, which has put stress on the system, which is why we now have a lack of capacity at the originating and destination points. So great question. Yes.
Piggybacking off of Alfredo's question to a certain extent, and then leading into a question that I had. So in the transportation industry, which is not the industry that I study, what is the trade-off between scale economies and competition? Because in the industry that I specifically study, prices have gone down as a result of scale economies. The administration is currently pushing on the competition angle, but there would be diseconomies of scale by breaking up the large oligopolists, which would then also increase prices more for consumers moving forward. And then the second part of that question is, given the labor shortage, how much of a markup have we estimated for firms having to pay the higher wages to specifically truck drivers, but more broadly? So how much of the burden is being pushed back on the consumer by the firm not internalizing it in the industry I study it? That's like
Great question. So two-part question. Part one, scale and competition. Let me address that one first. So of the industries I talked about, trucking is probably the one where scale is not the big issue. But trucking is also the one that's transporting, at least domestically, most of the products. Ocean liner, airlines, and waterways and rail, we would think have scale. Let me just talk about rail real quick. Before rail was deregulated, there was something like between 73 to 75 rail companies. We're down to 7 or 8, depending on if you look at the Canadian and Mexican rail competitors. It may be a national monopoly. We could say the same thing with ocean liners because they're alliances. Then the question of that is, excluding trucking, would this sense of having a national monopoly and the other sectors lead to non-competitive rates? For ocean liners, there's international competition. I would suspect that, and there's competition to, and some extent maybe with pipeline, I would expect that that would possibly keep rates relatively low. And then there's always the trucking, especially for rail. There is some substitutability that should also possibly suppress high rates. So I hope that answers that first question. Again, you've got scale other than trucking. Would that scale give these companies the opportunity to charge high rates and make a substantial profit? I would say this, by the way, think about airlines. Not till recently, they weren't even profitable. So the issue wasn't so much the rates, and transportation rates for fares aren't that bad. The second question was, given this labor shortage, there will likely be an increase. It has been a significant increase in wages for truck drivers. How much of that will be passed on to the customer? I'll give a definitive answer to this: most of it. So you're right there, because trucking has such a slim margin. They really can't hold on to those higher prices. I was trying to, he's forcing my hand on this. Folks, we may be in a new normal where we may see higher prices for an extended period of time, even with improved logistics systems. And I think that's what you're getting at. His question, even though it's a twofold question, they merge together because they're both talking about what's going to happen to prices of goods and services, which leads to the issue of, have we been living through good times? And did COVID show us, here's the reality? And part of the reality is relying on the monopolies, maybe at the production stage, relying heavily on Japan to make these chips showed us there's a problem. So there's not much that the transportation system can do to address that. Yes?
All these complex questions, just a simple
one. Uh-oh. Yes. Okay, so the question is a presumably simple question. which is actually the most difficult question I've had here. So the use of autonomous trucks, let me start by saying there's been autonomy in transportation for a long time, and that's been in air transport. We've had automated pilots in air transportation for quite a long time. So the first mile and second and the last mile, yes, human pilots kick in. So we do have some experience of autonomous use. I'm assuming your question is that how's that going to affect rates? Am I correct? And how is that going to affect shortage of drivers? So yes. So great. So the question is, would autonomous driving cut into employment of truck drivers, especially during a period when we see a tremendous increase in demand for truck drivers? Just as automatic pilots were not a complete substitute for pilots, it is my prediction that autonomous trucks will not result in the substitution of our friendly truck drivers. My suspicion is autonomous trucks will enhance safety. That may be the big contribution as opposed to job loss. We might be surprised that autonomous driving may actually enhance the situation for drivers, because you still need them for that last mile and that first mile. So I'm just like you have for the pilots, but it may improve safety. One more question, yeah.
They got rid of those extra people on the railroad, so that's it.
Yeah, well, that should never. That's because of new technology. Yeah.
We'll take care of their things through the automatic control there is better than pilot there.
Right.
The truck is piggyback, they cut out half the driver, or if nothing else, instead of piggyback, or
Okay, that's different. Okay, so for the audience in remote land, there's a two-part question. One is the use of piggyback. So you have these stacked or some containers. Yes, that would mean that a truck driver can now transport multiple volumes than before for one truck driver. Yes, that could reduce, that definitely would be a reduction in the demand for truck drivers. I'm not sold on autonomous driving reducing demand for truck drivers. That said, let me bring in the safety aspect of this. So with these longer trucks, there could be some issues with safety. I think that autonomous trucks probably enhance the safety records. Yes.
I think we should cut it out here.
Okay. Thank you.
I have questions.